At the end of Series 1, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Official card game was as close to balanced as it had ever been. By which I mean there was one deck, but that deck at least played the game correctly. Summoned Demon Beatdown sought to win the game by bringing the opponent's life points from 8,000 to 0, and it did that by spending its own life points freely, using Ultimate Offering to additionally summon a level 4 monster, then tribute that monster for its one normal summon of the turn in order to bring out the summoned demon. Critter, Witch of the Black Forest, Maneater Bug, and Hane Hane filled out the deck's pool of level 4 monsters, used to tutor other cards to hand, control the opponent's board, and deter them from attacking into face downs, while Gemini Elf, Mechanical Chaser, and Lejin served as level 4 beat sticks to secure an early advantage or stalemate position with the opponent, from which they could likewise be tributed to bring out the demon. This monster was effectively the focal axis for every competitive deck, with the goal of a duel being to successfully keep a monster out long enough to tribute it for the demon without it getting hit by flip effects or one of the restricted removal magic cards. Once either player got a demon out, the battle to control or stall it began, blocking it from attacking with Swords of Revealing Light, delaying its impact with Waboku, or destroying it outright with Fissure. However, even inside this basic back and forth beatdown trade, the seams of the game were always visible. A handful of absurdly powerful cards with completely arbitrary effects were sprinkled throughout the basic skeleton of Demon Beatdown, reined in only by the recent restricted list. Change of Heart, Monster Reborn, Thunderbolt, Black Hole, and Harpy's Feather Duster were all still in the format as 1 per deck cards, and Deck Destruction Virus was still unlimited, still capable of destroying all of the opponent's monsters with 1,000 or more attack for 3 turns, while also revealing their hand to you. Any one of these cards could completely change the flow and tempo of a game for no other reason than because they said so. It was in this environment that Konami began Series 2, which redesigned the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card template to allocate more space for the effect box and implement anti-counterfeiting measures in the form of a holographic icon in the bottom right corner. Magic and trap cards were broken up into normal, permanent, equip, and field subtypes, and given new icons that indicated which type they belonged to, which simplified the effect text so that many cards no longer needed to specify whether or not you destroyed them after use. This was also when Konami revised the Yu-Gi-Oh! Expert rules and made them into the only format, setting the maximum hand size to 6, instituting an automatic loss for a player that needed to draw a card while decked out, revising the turn structure so that the player to go first would draw a card on their very first turn, and increasing the size of the player's side deck to 15. This is something we haven't talked about yet because we haven't gotten to talk about any Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournaments in detail, but from the beginning, Konami's Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG had something that Pokemon and Monster Collection did not. A side deck of originally 10, now 15 cards, that the player could freely swap with the cards in their deck between games. The side deck was something that originated in the 1994 tournament rules for Magic the Gathering as a 15-card sideboard. The sideboard had been introduced to Magic alongside the 4-card limit that stopped players from running an unlimited number of any card, and it played an important role in competitive play. Magic was played in a best-of-3 format, where players needed to win 2 games to win the match, so players would pack their sideboards with counters to decks their own struggled with, counters to popular metagame decks, and alternative strategies that got around their opponent's counters, then, based on how their first game with their opponent went, decide which cards they should swap out for Game 2. It was not just a matter of seeing what the opponent did and countering it in the second game, but of getting inside the opponent's head and figuring out how they would change their strategy in Game 2, if at all, and preemptively slotting in counters to their counters. In terms of player skill, there's a limit to how far you can go with just improving your technical play of different creatures, spells, and combos in Magic, but your growth as a player when it comes to the sideboard is uncapped. No one ever stops improving at sideboarding unless they stop playing entirely. Yu-Gi-Oh! Made use of a similar principle, although unlike Magic, it lacked powerful hate cards in its early days, so the side deck was functionally not that useful during Series 1. In the previous video, I went over all the strategies from those early days and never mentioned side decking, because just about the only thing you could do with it was side 7 Tools of the Bandit or God's Judgment against Deck Destruction Virus or Last Will, and even then, it was a 1-deck format. For side decking to be meaningful, there has to be more than one viable deck in the format, so that the cards everyone is siding will change based on what deck they play. If you go to a tournament knowing that there's only one deck that can win fast enough to be viable, you'll build to beat that deck, and beat everything else too because you're playing that deck, and everything else isn't fast enough. The most important aspect to side decking was that it resulted in Konami going into the process of creating Yu-Gi-Oh's organized play under the assumption that games would be played in best of 3. Up to this point, best-of-3 tournaments were rare in Japan. They were only commonly played in Magic the Gathering, which had seen significant growth in late 1999 thanks to the Duel Masters manga, but was still a niche game. The only Pokemon TCG tournament to be played in best-of-3 was the Blastoise Mega Battle National Championship in August 1999, with all other tournaments up until 2017 being best-of-1. Playing tournament games as a set helped make Yu-Gi-Oh! Feel more skillful, even in formats where it really wasn't, and helped mainstream the idea in the early 2000s. This was also when Konami introduced the concept of chaining and spell speed. The logic behind it went like this. When you play a card like Swords of Revealing Light, and the opponent responds with God's Judgment, that forms a chain. The last card in the chain resolves first, then it goes backwards. So God's Judgment takes effect and negates Swords of Revealing Light before it can turn your cards face up. But if you activated your own God's Judgment in response to the opponent's, that would extend the chain. Your judgment negates the opponent's judgment, their card has no effect, and then Swords of Revealing Light resolves. Meanwhile, spell speed established how fast each effect was. Not just magic cards, but monster and trap effects as well. The importance of speed is that you have to be as fast or faster than an effect to start a chain. Most cards were spell speed 1, the slowest effect, including most magic cards and monster effects. Quick play magic cards were the only magic effects with a spell speed of 2, as were monster quick effects and most trap cards. The only spell speed 3 cards were counter traps, traps activated in response to other traps. The activation of a counter trap in response to one of these effects was important because it blocked either player from adding any more speed 2 effects to the chain, since the only valid response to a counter trap was another counter trap. At the time, the only counter trap cards were Magic Jammer, 7 Tools of the Bandit, and God's Judgment. The number of counter traps would gradually increase over the years, but remained a very exclusive club compared to other card types, as it was necessary to limit how easily a player could end a chain and what kinds of responses they could end it on. Spell speed is one of those game elements that really should have been written on cards directly. Mechanically, chains worked like in Magic the Gathering's effect stack, with the exception that the chain had to fully resolve once the last card was put in it, while in Magic players could add to the stack while there were still effects not yet resolved. Spell speeds 1 and 2 worked exactly like sorceries and instants, with players only able to respond to instants with other instants, while spell speed 3 acted as a kind of super instant. If you don't understand it, don't worry, because most Yu-Gi-Oh! Players don't either, and the further you go, the less sense it makes, which is why you can sometimes chain the effect of a continuous trap card to its own activation. Series 2 was much more planned out than Series 1. In addition to the core sets and promotional cards, the release schedule would be filled with reprint sets, reprinting cards previously printed in the Series 1 booster and volume expansions. These releases would coincide with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime series that began that April, with each set containing cards featured in the anime episodes around the time those sets came out. For the core players, these reprints would help drive down the price of deck staples, and for the casuals, they would feature flashy-looking but useless cards from the anime like Blue Eyes White Dragon, Black Magician, and Dragon Knight Gaia. In fact, there were so many reprints in Series 2 that there were only 4 core product releases in the year 2000. The first of these, Magic Ruler, revolved around magic effects as a way of introducing the spell speed concept. There are a number of important cards from it, but the most important was a lowly common, Cyclone, later localized as Mystical Space Typhoon. This card destroyed a single magic or trap card on the field, but did not negate its effect. This is one of the fundamentally different aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh's card design. In Magic, Pokemon, Monster Collection, and just about every other trading card game under the sun, destroying a card or removing it from the field ends its effect. In Yu-Gi-Oh, the effect persists until it's either fully resolved or negated, so even if a card is destroyed, that doesn't stop its effect. Not understanding this is one of the classic obstacles for new players, to the point that even the manga and anime series regularly mistake destruction for negating, leading to dramatic scenarios like, "I de-spell your de-spell," doing absolutely nothing in the real world. However, Cyclone offering simple one-for-one destruction was still important. Destroying a card while it was face down, before it could be activated, would still stop it. On your own turn, the opponent could chain their trap card in response to Cyclone to still get the effect, but since it's a quick play effect, you could set Cyclone on your turn and activate it on the opponent's after their trap was set. They wouldn't be able to chain the trap, because you can't activate a trap card during the same turn you set it, so thinking ahead like this still allowed for strategic plays, assuming you guessed that the card they set was one you would want to stop in the first place. After all, a set card in the Magic Trap Zone could be practically anything. It could be Deck Destruction Virus, or their own Cyclone, or it could even be Fake Trap, a card that only exists to dupe the opponent into destroying it. And of course, sometimes the opponent is just cheating and setting a monster in the back row so that they'll have an empty hand for Infernities. That of course only applies when the rules are being understood correctly, and at the time they were very often not. Konami did not have a robust judge program or means of easily disseminating rulings back then. There was no official Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh website until 2003, and the full expert rule revisions were only detailed in magazines and in the Booster R1 rule cards distributed 2 months later. It was actually hard to get good, reliable information about how to resolve these effects, which led to absurd local rulings like countering Mirror Force with Magic Cylinder. The idea being that the barrier that Mirror Force creates rebounds the monster's attack back at it, and Magic Cylinder diverts the rebounded attack to the opponent. It was completely stupid, but people actually believed this sort of thing, because their initial exposure to the game came from the manga, where you had stuff like Yugi using his catapult turtle to launch Dragon Knight Gaia into the Castle of Dark Illusions, shattering its flotation ring and causing it to collapse on top of the opponent's monsters beneath it after the sword's revealing light wore off because they were now holding it up, which yeah, that's totally a thing, and the monsters couldn't get out of the way because the player killer's yellow luster shield barrier was preventing them from moving, and this somehow reduced the player killer's life points to 0. When that's how you learned the game, yeah, sure, Magic Cylinder redirects Mirror Force. Moving on, Cyclone was not the highest impact card of the set. It wasn't even in the top 3. That spot belonged to the so-called 3 regalia of hand destruction, the Handesu no Jingi. This was a trifecta of magic cards that all revolved around destroying the opponent's hand. Confiscation allowed players to pay 1,000 life points to discard any card from their opponent's hand. The Forceful Sentry shuffled a card from the opponent's hand into their deck, and Delinquent Duo paid 1,000 life points to make the opponent discard 1 random card and 1 more card of their choice. Now, as I've said before, the only life point that matters is your last one. By this time, players were already spending their LP quite freely on Ultimate Offering and God's Judgment. They were able to recognize that the tempo advantage of discarding their opponent's key cards vastly outweighed the loss in life points. This created a problem. Hand destruction on its own is one of those things that cannot be balanced without meaningful costs. In theory, you lost a card by playing Forceful Sentry, and the opponent lost a card, but you got more out of both of you losing a card than the opponent got out of it, because you got to play a card and the opponent didn't. Hand destruction goes all the way back to Magic the Gathering. It was one of the characteristic features of Black's playstyle from the very beginning, but it was balanced by having a mana cost, so that discarding cards from the opponent's hand was done in exchange for you not being able to spend that mana on a creature or artifact instead. Hand destruction in Yu-Gi-Oh! Represented an exchange of practically nothing. You still got your normal summons for the turn, still got to play other cards, and this is really one of the fundamental challenges with balancing a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! That does not have an explicit resource system. You don't have to pay for anything. If all this sounds eerily familiar, it's because the exact same problem had been playing out in the Japanese Pokemon card game between November 1997 and 1 month before Magic Ruler, when the expanded restricted list was introduced for the secret Super Battle tournaments and effectively removed most hand destruction from the format. Before, players had been quitting Pokemon to go play Yu-Gi-Oh! Because they were tired of losing the opening coin flip and getting hit with Impostor Oak's Revenge, the Rocket's Trap, and Rocket's Sneak Attack. Now they were losing the opening dice roll and getting hit with Delinquent Duo, Confiscation, and Forceful Sentry. It was like living in a time loop. Even more insulting was that there was a ban on 2 of the cards in the set less than a month after it dropped, and neither of them were part of the regalia. Konami didn't limit Confiscation, Forceful Sentry, or Delinquent Duo until mid-July, so the only response people had to these cards for about 3 months was to just not run combos. They played a version of good stuff with hand destruction in it and some form of demon beatdown. Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh! Historian Yushi described it as being like a jigoku-ezu, a painting illustrating the sinful being punished by demons in hell. The cards Konami did limit were Snatch Steal, an equip magic card that took control of an opponent's monster in exchange for them gaining 1,000 life points at the start of each of their turns, and Painful Choice, a card that let you choose 5 cards from your deck to show the opponent. They would choose one for you to add to your hand, and the rest would be sent to the graveyard. Snatch Steal should never have been printed, because it was an arguably better version of a card that was already limited, Change of Heart. Even so, it only ended up semi-limited in the May ban list. This was not nearly enough to deal with it, because Snatch Steal's life bonus was simply not enough to offset the extra damage dealt by seizing a summoned demon or the card and tempo advantage gained from spending 1 card to steal something the opponent put 2 or more into. Like Pot of Greed and other degenerate cards before it, Snatch Steal improved every deck it was put in regardless of what the deck's goals were. Just about the only thing reining it in at all was that hitting it with Cyclone would actually end its effect because it was an equip magic card. The card would eventually be bumped up to limited status 6 months later and finally be put on the Forbidden List 6 years down the line in September 2006, where it would remain until the end of time. Actually, you know what? I just jinxed it, so when they unban Snatch Steal in the OCG, leave a comment on this video. I want to know. Painful Choice was more of a preemptive ban than anything else. Fortunately, Konami already errated Critter and Witch of the Black Forest before Magic Ruler came out, since as you may recall from the previous video, those cards' effects pre-errata would activate off the discard. Unfortunately, Painful Choice was still poorly designed. While at the time the card wasn't widely played and didn't have much utility, by the end of the year it would be a centerpiece in both Cannon Soldier burn decks and Exodia. Inherently, the card has no cost beyond playing it. It refunds itself by adding a card from deck to hand, and fills up the graveyard, which over the next several months would transform into a second hand rather than a proper discard pile. And frankly, most of the criticisms applied to these cards are applicable to everything in Magic Ruler. The set was a huge source of power creep, not in raw attack and defense points, but in card effects. The magic card Hurricane doubled as both Harpy's Feather Duster style control and a way of bouncing one's own cards back to hand to reuse their effects. Upstart Goblin was a poor man's Pot of Greed, but in a format with Pot of Greed newly limited, it too became a deck staple because giving the opponent LP to reduce your deck size by 1 was an easy trade. All of these cards would do time on the ban list sooner or later, and Magic Ruler was seen as particularly damaging coming so soon off of the Last Will Exodia loop. However, that was just the perspective of established hardcore players. The beginning of Series 2 was actually a massive boost to the game's popularity, and saw more people than ever before coming into it. Not because of anything the game was doing, but because 2 days before Magic Ruler launched in Japan, Studio Gallup's Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime began airing on TV Tokyo. The influence of this anime is hard to overstate, and if you're coming into these videos with any familiarity with Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's very likely that your first exposure was also through this series. It skipped the first 59 chapters of the manga, compressing them down into the first episode of the Duelist Kingdom arc, and pivoted the focus of the overall franchise away from playing a multitude of games to being an advertising tool to sell Konami's specific card game. But as an advertising tool, it was actually pretty poor, because it gave the audience a false concept of what the game was. The initial Duelist Kingdom arc followed the manga and used the older No Tributes rule set from before the expert rules were introduced. Yet, even once the series got to the Battle City arc 1 year after going on air, the version of Duel Monsters played in the anime was far different, in some ways better, than the actual card game. Players had 4,000 life points instead of 8,000, monsters could be summoned in face-up defense mode, fusion monsters counted as multiple monsters for the purpose of tribute summons, and they had a kind of summoning sickness. They couldn't attack in the same turn they were placed. If a player were attacked directly but summoned a monster mid-attack, that monster became the new target, and if an attack target left the field, then the attack would be negated. In the real game, both of these scenarios would initiate a replay that allows the attacking player to choose a new target to battle, but the anime and manga allowed for mid-battle summons to counter the opponent's plays in much the same way activating a trap card would. Practically every magic card was treated as a quick play magic that could be activated during the battle phase or on the opponent's turn, even field magic cards. And while the anime rewrote certain duels to make them more accurate to the OCG, in the original manga there were even more restrictions to try and balance effects. Almost all special summoned monsters had summoning sickness unless their effect explicitly allowed them to attack in the same turn they were placed. Players could only set 1 magic and trap card each turn. They could only activate 1 magic card from hand each turn, and they could only control up to 5 cards in total across all of their zones. Although these last rules would have a profound impact on the real game, they rarely needed to be brought up in the manga itself. Among all these differences and more, the 3 biggest were actually the most subtle. Destruction being treated as negation, the lack of replays, and the ways effects and timings were resolved. The fact of the matter is that not only were players very confused in Japan when Cyclone first dropped, their confusion was enhanced by how the anime and manga constantly equated destruction with negation. Episodes like the Yugi vs. Jonochi duel in Battle City would have D-spell negating, and the difference between destruction and negation was never clearly explained in the series. Chaining wasn't explained in the series, and it's a fundamental game mechanic. The implications of destruction and negation being the same are massive, since it greatly weakens magic and trap cards as a whole, while also meaning you can negate a cyclone with another cyclone, making the card practically all-powerful. And the lack of replays means that in the anime and manga, a player could activate a magic or trap that would summon monsters to defend them as they were being attacked. In the OCG and the localized TCG, changing the number of monsters in play during battle automatically initiates a replay, where the attacking player chooses a new target or cancels the attack. So for example, when Jonochi plays Scapegoat during Battle City Finals to summon 4 sheep tokens as Kaiba's attacking him, and Kaiba's Blue Eyes White Dragon and Blade Knight destroys the tokens instead, if the anime were accurate to real life, Kaiba's attack would stop, the players would back up, and he would select new targets. That particular example doesn't sound all that different, but consider how that scenario plays out when the monster you summon is stronger than the attacker. In Chapter 6 of the Yu-Gi-Oh! R manga, Kirk Dixon uses the trap card Yellow Alert to special summon Caterpillar Tank in attack mode as he's being attacked by Dark Magician Girl. Since Caterpillar Tank has 2700 attack, the attacking player in this case would take 700 damage and their monster would be destroyed. In another case, the later Yu-Gi-Oh! GX manga had Judai use the trap card Another Fusion to fuse 2 of his monsters while his opponent was attacking, creating elemental hero The Earth, which then became the target of his opponent's attack because it was the only monster in play, and destroyed the attacking Cyber Dinosaur in the process, because Cyber Dinosaur's attack had just been halved by the trap card Swamp of the Fallen. The implications of not having replays are huge because it opens up a whole other route for trapping your opponent using their own attacks. The effect resolution is another point where Yu-Gi-Oh! Media doesn't agree with Yu-Gi-Oh! The game. In the OCG and TCG, effects either resolve in their entirety or not at all, while in the anime and manga, effects are fulfilled as much as possible. This applies to both conditions to activate effects and the effects themselves. For example, in episode 72 of the anime, the Mask of Light activates card exchange, causing him and his dual partner, Mask of Darkness, to exchange all of the cards in their hands. However, Light has no cards in hand at the time card exchange is activated. In the real game, because he doesn't have any cards to exchange, the effect wouldn't go off. That also ties into how those effects can resolve in the first place. In the anime and manga, any card present on the field when its timing was met could be used, while in the real game, cards can miss the timing. Missing the timing is one of the most hated and most foundational rules interactions of Yu-Gi-Oh! As near as I can glean, bearing in mind this was more than 20 years ago, it is a rule that was introduced with the Series 2 expert rules, and did not exist during Series 1 or under the previous Koseki rules. The basic rule is, if an effect says you can use it when something happens, then when you try to use it, the last thing to happen has to be its condition. Let's look at a card we're already familiar with as an example. Post-erratum Witch of the Black Forest. When we last saw the witch, she had just had her effect changed to, when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you may add a monster with 1500 or less defense from your deck to your hand, then shuffle your deck. Let's say you have the witch on your field and tribute her to normal summon the summoned demon. She was sent from the field to the graveyard, but the last thing to happen was a monster summon. Therefore, your Witch of the Black Forest effect misses the timing, and you can't use it to search your deck for a monster. Under the Series 1 expert rules, effects would always activate when they met their timing, so you could tribute the witch for the demon and then use her effect. Now, as of Witch of the Black Forest's 4th erratum in 2017, her effect no longer says when. It now says if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard. And because it says if and not when, you can now use her effect after having just tributed her for a tribute summon. Missing the timing was devised in part to balance the unpredictability of the game. Konami was releasing new cards at an alarming rate, with new expansions twice a month throughout 1999 and 2000, and they were doing so with little to no playtesting, using erratas and the ban list as their means of patching cards after the fact. Kinda like how modern video games are released unfinished, and they patch them up after the fact with downloadable content and bug fixes. A common misconception among Japanese players is that missing the timing did not exist until November 2001, when the last booster set of Series 2 introduced Leaf Fairy, which could burn the opponent for 500 LP by discarding a card equipped to it. If missing the timing did not exist, Leaf Fairy would have an infinite loop with the Gilfer Demon from the Yugi structure deck. Gilfer could be equipped to Leaf Fairy, discarded for the fairy's effect, and then re-equipped to the fairy by its own effect, burning the opponent for 500 each time until they hit 0. However, this was just how most players at the time discovered missing the timing existed. The rule was already there all the way back when Magic Ruler launched. In an example directly from the anime, when Kaiba activates a genocide virus in response to Peden the Dark Clown being destroyed in the 2004 Pyramid of Light movie, then uses Peden's effect afterward to special summon another Peden from the deck, he shouldn't be able to do that, because the last thing to happen was Genocide Virus's effect rather than Peden's destruction by battle, so Peden misses the timing. That play would work if this was Magic the Gathering, Duel Masters, Battle Spirits, or Cardfight Vanguard. Literally any other card game would make this possible, except for this one, because this is a game where the cards were made first and the rules were invented later, and the end result is held together with scotch tape and chewing gum. The anime is playing a different game with different rules, often with cards that don't actually exist and that you can't actually buy, so what are they selling again? In the interest of undue fairness, if missing the timing did not exist, then it would absolutely break many card effects, as in the example of Gilfer. We can all agree that infinite burn loops should never be a part of any game. But that, along with the ever-changing ban list, influx of card erratas, exodia and cannon soldier loops, hand destruction, and the constant disconnect between the game being played on TV and in manga magazines versus the game being played on tabletops, demonstrates that there were major design issues not just from day one of the OCG, but even after Konami did multiple major rule revisions and tried to fix the game during the expert era. It's actually hard to learn to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Because Yu-Gi-Oh! Puts out its own official disinformation. On top of the anime and manga not lining up with the real game, none of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games followed the real rules either. The first Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters game predated the actual rules and featured no effect monsters or trap cards, and subsequent games built on the same engine introduced things like monsters having elemental weaknesses, or in the PlayStation game Shin Duel Monsters, they had assignable Guardian Stars that increased or decreased their stats when battling. While players would also draw up to their full hand size every turn, cards could be placed in face-down attack and face-up defense mode. Any monster could be fused without needing a fusion card first, and there were no tribute summons. There would not be a rules-accurate version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Until Duel Monsters 5 Expert 1 on the Game Boy Advance in July 2001. And even after Konami began making these expert games, they would continue producing inaccurate ones like the Sacred Cards or Reshef of Destruction. Contrast that to games like Pokemon Card GB on the Game Boy Color, Magic the Gathering for the Sega Dreamcast, the Japanese Duel Masters trilogy on Game Boy Advance, and their companion games on GameCube and PlayStation 2. From day one, Yu-Gi-Oh! Had an onboarding problem, and later games would learn a lot from these mistakes. When Duel Masters launched in Japan, Takara made sure to have a trilogy of rules-accurate handheld games running concurrently with titles on console that replicated the entire card pool of their day, while the anime series followed the real-world game one-to-one. When Bandai pushed out Battle Spirits in 2008, they would similarly keep the anime rules accurate and use a Nintendo DS game to help broaden the TCG's reach, and their examples were picked up and improved upon by Bushiroad's Card Fight Vanguard and future Card Buddy Fight franchises. Many of the failures to come were games that did not learn from Yu-Gi-Oh!'s example, titles like Live on Card Live or Kakeru, where the anime never made it clear how to play the game itself, while titles that were exported to English-speaking countries but failed to thrive overseas often had sabotaged localizations, as in the case of Duel Masters, or did not have their accompanying anime and games exported along with them, as with Battle Spirits. Succeeding in this market is not just a matter of copying history, but of improving upon it. So this massive rocket ship takeoff of the greater Yu-Gi-Oh! Media franchise in 2000 was both a big boom for its player base and a source of conflict. Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh! Historian Yushi described this as anime to genjitsu no sensou, a war between anime and reality. You have the idealized image of the anime and then what actually happens when you show up at a shop and put cards on the table. And while I'm talking about the Japanese experience here, I already know this is not a uniquely Japanese experience at all. As the dust finally settled on the Series 2 format, a new best deck began to emerge in response to the prevalence of hand destruction. It was a straightforward deck with as limited combos as possible, a revival of equipment beatdown. But rather than the light attribute beatdown of Series 1, this beatdown was focused on 3 new cards from Magic Ruler: Demon's Axe, Demon's Kiss, and Maha Vilo. Demon's Axe and Demon's Kiss were both equip magic cards, with the axe gifting its target 1000 attack and allowing its controller to tribute a monster when the axe was sent to the graveyard to put it on top of the deck, and the Kiss endowing the target with 700 extra attack and the same returning to deck failsafe but with a cost of 500 life points instead of monster tribute. By now it feels like beating a dead horse to point out power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but these cards really embodied the idea of strictly better. They had no drawbacks, came with a built-in way to get them back from a cyclone or monster destruction, and gave a much greater power boost than past equip magic cards while having no increase in cost or conditions to use. They were not just strictly better than another equip magic card, they were strictly better than every equip magic card the game had ever printed. Maha Vilo was the cornerstone of the deck, a 4-star monster with 1550 attack points that gained an additional 500 attack for each card equipped to it, in addition to the power boost from the equipped cards themselves. With a single Demon's Axe, Maha Vilo would shoot up to 3050 attack, just enough to slay a Blue Eyes White Dragon, but for a fraction of the investment necessary to bring one out. With 2 axes, it would swing for 4550 points, over half the opponent's starting life value. Maha Vilo's effect counted any card equipped to it, so snatch stealing an opponent's Maha Vilo would give it 500 more power than it had under its original owner's control. Mahavailo's availability as a common in Magic Ruler made it especially popular, and Equipment Beat soon overtook the format. There was just no reason to play Demon Beatdown when Equipment Beat did everything it did better, so players built for the mirror match instead, running Tailor of the Fickle. This quick play Magic card switched one equip card's target to another, allowing a player to simultaneously steal equipment off an opponent's Mahavailo and attach it to their own, at minimum creating a 1,000 point difference. Stealing a Demon's Axe would extend that to a 2,000 point difference, and it could even be done on the opponent's turn, during their battle phase as they were attacking. It could also be changed to an opponent's copy of it, creating Tailor Wars, where two players tried to steal equipment that had just been stolen off them. There were, of course, plenty of answers to Equipment Beat: Harpy's Feather Duster, Snatch Steal, even Hurricane from Magic Ruler itself, but the key was that you could run these answers in Equipment Beat itself, which made it its own best counter. It was also cheap, because the deck's skeleton was available entirely in Magic Ruler, and anything supplementary had its price driven down by the reprint sets. It's been said that if you took out the hand destruction cards, this would have been the most fun format Yu-Gi-Oh! Had up to this point in time, because there was a high degree of interactivity from all the equipped cards and quick play magics, and the one-deck nature of the format actually worked in its favor when that one deck was built around equipment rather than just vanilla beatdown. You and your opponent both wanted to be using each other's cards, and you had plenty of ways to steal them and then steal them back. Unfortunately, hand destruction was here to stay. Just under a month after Magic Ruler's launch, Konami pushed out the May 2000 ban list, limiting Harpy's Feather Duster and semi-limiting Snatch Steal, and doing nothing about Delinquent Duo or its friends. This would be the first of many restrictions applied during Series 2. It was in this year that Konami began to take a proactive approach to the ban list, updating it every 2 months from this point on, changing what cards could be played almost faster than players could keep up. Between these and the reprint sets, which were mostly unplayable junk with 1 or 2 meaningful cards in each, there was a great deal of unrest throughout Series 2's run. The core sets like Magic Ruler had insane game-changing cards power creeping stuff that was only a few months old. The reprint sets were full of iconic but useless monsters, the ban list was now ever-changing, and none of the noobs coming in from the anime or video games knew how to play properly. The second core set of Series 2, Pharaoh's Servant, dropped on July 13th. Like Magic Ruler, this set marked a major shift in how decks were played, but instead of magic cards, its focus was on monsters. Of its magic cards, the highest impact was Megamorph, an equipped magic that doubled the equipped monster's base attack if your life points were less than the opponent, and halved them if they were more. On a Mahavailo, one Megamorph could push it up to 3,500 if you were behind on LP, which was easy to achieve with Ultimate Offering and or God's Judgment. But because the modification was to base attack, Summoned Demon was the more common target for Megamorph, as it would jump up to 5k. Add in a Demon's Axe and the demon would swing for 6. Winning a direct point-for-point exchange in battle could reverse this, as your monster would then drop an attack, but the real objective was to attack the opponent directly and remove all their LP in a single swing, which was quite easy to do with so many LP costs in use at the time. Both players often voluntarily went down to 6k or less through the use of Ultimate Offering or God's Judgment. An alternative use was to equip Megamorph to an opponent's monster to weaken it, and the monster Megamorph was on could even be modified using Tailor of the Fickle, weakening the opponent's monster one turn and strengthening your own the next. As part of its monster focus, Pharaoh's Servant introduced a series of 6 Recruiters, level 4 monsters that when destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard could special summon a monster of a specific attribute with 1500 or less attack from the deck in attack position. The face of these recruiters was Killer Tomato, who summoned dark monsters, but Tomato was joined by Giant Rat for Earth, UFO Turtle for Fire, Shine Angel for Light, Grizzly Mother for Water, and Dragonfly for Wind. The conceptually similar but distinct monsters Giant Virus and Nimble Mamanga special summoned any number of themselves from the deck when destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, with Virus burning the opponent for 500 LP and summoning its copies in attack position, while Momanga healed its controller for 1000 and summoned its brethren in defense mode. These cards allowed duelists to have tribute fodder going into their next turn, and over time would continue to find roles as staples in different deck types for many years to come. The set also introduced a successor to Metamorpot, Cyberpod. Where Metamorpot caused both players to discard their hands and draw 5 cards when it was flip summoned, Cyberpod destroyed all monsters on the field and had both players reveal the top 5 cards of their decks, summoning all level 4 or lower monsters revealed and adding the rest to their hands. Now, on the surface, it might seem like Cyberpod could be balanced by how it gave both players 5 cards after resetting the field, but that's not accounting for how it interacts with hand size. If you activate Cyberpod while you have more cards in hand than the opponent, then you will always come out ahead in card advantage, because once you've wiped the field, your hands are the only thing determining who has the lead. Much like how Snatch Steal was a better version of the already banned Change of Heart, Cyberpod was like an improved Black Hole, and Pot of Greed at the same time. Why'd they print this thing anyway? Well, Cyberpod lasted about 4 months in the OCG before it was limited down to 1 in the November 2000 ban list, but in that time it became the central monster in a new deck that emerged in retaliation to hand destruction: Mill. Mill was really not possible prior to Series 2 because the rules didn't have an automatic loss for the player that tried to draw while having no cards left in their deck. Instead, the player with more LP would win if either player decked out. With the change to auto losses upon a failed draw, Cyberpod joined the old Needleworm and Metamorpod in forming the basic skeleton for decking the opponent out, supported by Critter, Witch of the Black Forest, and Killer Tomato as the designated searchers. Another monster out of Pharaoh's Servant, Dark Familiar, was brought in because its on-destruction effect allowed both players to special summon a monster from their graveyards in face-up attack or face-down defense mode. Critter, Witch, and Tomato were used to search Metamorpod and Dark Familiar. Metamorpod forced both players to discard and replace their hands, and Dark Familiar recycled Metamorpod and Cyberpod by placing them face down directly onto the field, where they could be activated a second time. With the recent erratas on Witch and Critter, destroying either of them or Familiar with Cyberpod would set off their effects, and each pot or pod activated would get the opponent 5 cards closer to death. However, Cyberpod and Dark Familiar were both sources of confusion in their own right, because despite the new template used for Series 2, their wordings were not conventional. Cyberpod didn't actually say to add the non-monster cards it revealed to hand on its first printing, so players had to obtain rulings from Konami, which were slow to transmit in an era where the internet wasn't the main method of communication. Dark Familiar also didn't say special summon on its first print, but instead said place, which led players to wonder if this counted as summoning, if Dark Familiar could place itself from the graveyard, and this resulted in local rulings not always lining up with how cards were supposed to be played officially. Pharaoh's Servant introduced one more card that complemented mill decks, Messenger of Peace. This was a permanent magic card that cost 100 life points during each standby phase it was active, and stopped all monsters with 1500 or more attack from declaring attacks. It was an effective way of stopping both equipment beatdown and general good stuff decks in their tracks, as the opponent would need to blow a cyclone on it to get their attacks in, and against mill they would just get their attackers blown up by Cyberpod sooner or later anyway. As a countermeasure, good stuff and equipment beat ran tribute to the doomed to eliminate Cyberpod without activating it, but always ran the risk of popping a Critter or Witch instead. Some decks actually began running more than 40 cards to counter mill, which was unheard of at the time. The rules of the OCG at this point allowed for a deck of up to 100 cards, but no one ran more than 40 before Cyberpod was printed because the more cards you run, the less likely you are to draw any specific one in a given hand. However, exactly how prevalent mill was at this point is disputed. Many players felt it was still inferior to good stuff and equipment beatdown with hand destruction, and the real impact of mill at this stage of Series 2 was hard to gauge. What was definitely not prevalent coming out of Pharaoh's Servant was the OCG's first attempt at a formal named archetype: Toon Monsters. These were cards originally created for the antagonist of the Duelist Kingdom arc, Pegasus, to use in his climactic duels with Kaiba and Yugi. Their gimmick was that they could not be summoned unless the permanent magic card Toon World was in play. Their summons were always special summons, and if Toon World was destroyed, they would also be destroyed. And they required a 500 life point cost just to declare attacks and could not attack in the same turn they were special summoned, but in exchange they could attack the opponent directly if the opponent did not control a Toon monster of their own. They might have been workable if Toon World itself did not require a 1000 life point cost just to play, and an additional 500 point cost at the start of each of your standby phases. Now, if Toon World was sent to the graveyard, you would get all the LP you paid for it back, but that was small consolation when you were likely losing a lot of card advantage seeing all of your Toon monsters disappear just like that. And this mechanic actually made the game more complicated by requiring you to keep track of how much LP you had spent specifically on Toon World since its activation. The fact that the opponent could just blow up your whole strategy with Cyclone, Despell, Harpy's Feather Duster, or Hurricane just made the whole thing dead on arrival. Even after Toon World was errated early the next year to remove its standby cost, it also lost the clause where it returned the LP you spent on it, so it was never playable. At this point in Series 2, competitive play was still largely confined to local tournaments. The first large-scale OCG tournament to actually fire would not take place until late August, by which time there would be several other game-changing promotional cards in the mix. These promos debuted on July 13th as pack-in cards for the third Game Boy video game, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters 3 Tri-Holy God Advent. While the anime at this stage was just 13 episodes into the Duelist Kingdom arc, the manga was already at the midpoint of the Battle City arc, which centered around the 3 Egyptian god cards: the Heavenly Dragon Osiris, the Great Divine Soldier of Obelisk, and the Winged Divine Dragon of Ra. However, the cards themselves did not appear directly in the game, instead making cameos in the credits sequence that foreshadowed their appearance in the fourth Duel Monsters game, Battle of Great Duelist. Duel Monsters 3 featured 8 promos, but only 3 of them mattered: All-Purpose Landmine Glamour, Killer Snake, and Cybertech Wyvern. Cybertech Wyvern was just summoned demon with 400 more defense, while Glamour was a trap card that destroyed whichever of the opponent's attack mode monsters had the most attack points when they declared an attack, which made it a popular supplement to Mirror Force now that Mirror Force was limited. Killer Snake, known internationally as Sinister Serpent, was the big standout of the promos. Its original effect allowed you to return it to your hand from the graveyard at each of your standby phases, causing you to maintain card advantage across multiple turns even as you tributed it, or gain card advantage off of discarding it for Graceful Charity, or by tutoring it with Painful Choice. Searching 3 copies of Killer Snake with Painful Choice was a net +2, and even more pressingly, it would become a major component of that year's Cannon Soldier burn deck several months in. However, at the beginning, Killer Snake was underestimated and undervalued in the singles market, to the point that some stores didn't even put it in their display case, relegating it to sit in long boxes with other miscellaneous low-value promotional cards. It took time for people to really warm up to what you could do with it. 2 days after Duel Monsters 3, Konami put out the 4th restricted list, finally limiting Confiscation, the Forceful Sentry, and semi-limiting Delinquent Duo and Gravekeeper's Servant. While it would have made the players happier to limit Delinquent Duo as well, having hand destruction restricted to just 4 cards in the deck greatly reduced the effectiveness of it in general use. Semi-limiting Gravekeeper's Servant was a controversial decision that some players felt was unfair, as at the time mill was not very widespread, and Gravekeeper's Servant itself wasn't particularly strong. It wasn't even really played, because Swords of Revealing Light and Messenger of Peace were both more popular choices for that slot in the deck. Functionally, making the opponent unable to attack for 3 turns was a more guaranteed way to get 3 cards out of their deck than Gravekeeper's Servant, so players ended up scratching their heads trying to figure out what undiscovered combo Konami was trying to ban. With the regalia of hand destruction restricted, good stuff morphed back into something resembling its original form as Summoned Demon Beatdown, now incorporating Megamorph, while Equipment Beat with Maha Vilo, Demon's Axe, and Megamorph was its major rival. Mill rose to prominence in this time as the 3rd major deck. While the differences between Demon Beat and Equipment Beat could often blur to the point of the 2 decks sometimes being one and the same, Mill was completely distinct as its own separate strategy. In part because of Mill's role in the tournament environment and the occasional play of the limited hand destruction cards, Exodia was not remotely playable at this time. August 10th brought with it Premium Pack 3. As you will probably recall from past videos, the Premium Packs originated as an event-exclusive booster pack distributed at the 1999 National Championships in the Tokyo Dome, which ended in disaster. In the aftermath of the Tokyo Dome riot, Konami downplayed the Premium Pack product lineup. Pack 2 was only used to print Ritual Monster versions of the National Championship vanillas, which nobody wanted because Ritual Monsters sucked, and was distributed at Jump Festa 1999, while Premium Pack 3 was used to reprint the Tokyo Dome participation prizes for the general public, and marked the first time a premium product was sold in general card shops instead of at an event. Most of the Premium Pack 3 cards didn't matter except for one. This was a fusion monster with 4500 attack and 3800 defense, formed from the fusion of 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons, originally created to give Kaiba a climactic card to summon in his fateful rematch with Yugi during the Duelist Kingdom arc. And if you'll think back to about 8 months earlier, way back in Booster 6, there was that one card Devil Franken that let you pay 5000 LP to special summon any monster from your fusion deck. Okay, look. Normal summon Devil Franken. Pay 5000 LP, special summon Ultimate Dragon, attach Megamorph to Ultimate Dragon, it now has 9000 attack. Swing. GG. Very high skill, much strategy, great game Konami. Devil Franken Blue Eyes was the second one-turn kill deck after the previous year's Last Will Cannon Soldier Exodia loop, and it was an extremely prevalent one because it only required 2 cards to do. The one advantage that fusion monsters had was that they existed in a separate fusion deck and didn't need to be drawn. Once you removed the disadvantage of needing to have 3 or 4 specific cards in hand to summon them, it was only natural that the most powerful fusion available would wreak havoc. Devil Franken could be easily searched with Critter or Killer Tomato, and while Megamorph generally needed to be drawn directly, it could also be searched by using Painful Choice, fetching it from the graveyard with Magician of Faith. The very last thing holding the deck back was the necessity to deal combat damage to win and the threat of the opponent's ultimate dragon retaliating against one's own Devil Franken if your attack was stopped by a Glamour, Chained Boomerang, or something else entirely. So these Devil Franken OTK decks ran a lot of removal. Harpy's Feather Duster, Hurricane, Cyclone, Tribute to the Doomed, that sort of thing. Counter trap cards like Magic Jammer and God's Judgment became essential to counter the opponent's counters. But despite all these advantages, Devil Franken OTK was not the deck that won the big tournament of the year. That's because Konami banned it 5 days after Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon was printed, limiting Megamorph to 1 and making the OTK nearly impossible to pull off. The fact that people remember the week when it was legal at all speaks to how fast the metagame was changing. Yushi remembered feeling that the ban happened too fast, and believed that Konami's R&D team must have already known about the combo back when Megamorph was printed, issuing the new list preemptively. However, Devil Franken and Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon were themselves untouched, so many good stuff decks absorbed them, using traps to defend the Franken during the one turn it would be vulnerable, immediately after summoning Ultimate. It was 5 days after the restriction, on August 20th, that Konami held the Asia Championship, the game's first international tournament. At the time, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was only sold in Asia, which made this the de facto world championship of its day. Konami took inspiration from Creatures Inc.'s Pokemon TCG competitions, requiring players to enter a raffle to win their entry into the tournament. Participants were given these passes to indicate their right to participate, and just 3 countries were included: Japan, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. While the tournament was somewhat biased in Japan's favor, with West Japan and East Japan's tournament bracket having its finalists seeded directly into grand finals against the winner of a Taiwan versus Hong Kong match, the Asia Championship was ultimately won by Tam Yi Look from Hong Kong. His deck was not Mill or Beatdown, but Cannon Soldier Burn. It ran 3 copies each of Cannon Soldier, Killer Snake, Critter, Witch of the Black Forest, and Magician of Faith, plus 2 copies of Mask of Darkness, 1 Giant Soldier of Stone, Wall of Illusion, Cyberpod, and Muka Muka. Its magic cards were 3 copies of Painful Choice, 2 Delinquent Duo, Hurricane, Snatch Steal, Monster Reborn, Tribute to the Doomed, and Graceful Charity, with 1 each of Pot of Greed, Change of Heart, Thunderbolt, Harpy's Feather Duster, Swords Revealing Light, and Black Hole. Finally, the traps consisted of 2 God's Judgment and 1 each of Deck Destruction Virus, Mirror Force, Ultimate Offering, and Magic Jammer, with no fusion deck for a total of 48 cards. The idea behind this specific era of Cannon Burn was not to deal damage solely through beatdown or burn, but to weigh in at about half and half, resulting in a beatdown deck that won twice as fast as regular beat, but without the brick potential of pure burn. The retrospective consensus is that Cannon Burn was chosen because of its metagame advantages over Mill. At the time, Mill was believed to hold the advantage over traditional beatdown because of how disruptive Cyberpod was to the board, but Cannon Burn was built around efficient use of Killer Snake. Painful Choice would tutor 3 Killer Snakes along with Graceful Charity and Ultimate Offering, which could be retrieved with Saint Magician and Mask of Darkness later, while the snakes would bounce back to hand at the start of each turn to be used as discard targets for Graceful Charity, Tribute to the Doomed, and Magic Jammer. With Cannon Soldier out, Ultimate Offering would enable a 3,000 point burn through the opponent's life, beginning with either Critter or Witch of the Black Forest, and then cycling through both playsets of each with Cannon Soldier. Muka Muka from Volume 6, reprinted earlier that February in Metal Raiders, acted as the deck's finishing move, as with 3 Killer Snakes returning to hand at the start of the turn, it could easily reach up to 3,000 attack power. Back home in Japan, with Hand Destruction and Devil Franken OTK limited out of the game, it was becoming apparent that rather than a return to good stuff and equipment beatdown, Mill was the new deck to beat. As a result, the Cannon Burn deck began to slowly proliferate once news of the Asia Championship results spread in magazines and by word of mouth. September brought the 3rd core booster of Series 2, Curse of Anubis. If Magic Ruler was the magic-focused set of the year, and Pharaoh's Servant was monster-focused, then Curse of Anubis was the trap set. In fact, its most famous monster revolved entirely around traps. The android Psycho Shocker. Psycho Shocker was a key card for supporting character Jonochi in the Battle City arc of the manga, though his anime debut was still 7 months off in the future. His effect was slightly watered down compared to the manga. All traps could not be used, and any current traps would be negated. As a single tribute monster, Psycho Shocker's effect on tournament play was immense, as it was only 100 points shy of matching the summoned demon's attack power, and being that it also had exactly 1500 defense, it could be searched by Witch of the Black Forest. This resulted in Shocker replacing the demon outright, bringing an end to demon beatdown, and establishing in the player's eyes that nothing was sacred when it came to power creep. Even the summoned demon that had shaped the metagame for over a year could get phased out. Other key cards from the set included Imperial Order, Call of the Living Dead, and Premature Burial. Imperial Order negated all magic cards in exchange for 700 life points every turn. Living Dead special summoned a monster from its controller's graveyard for as long as Living Dead remained face up on the field, and Premature Burial did the same thing for 800 LP, but also equipped itself to the card, meaning it could buff Maha Vilo. These last two cards were both more balanced versions of Monster Reborn that were restricted to their user's side of the board and provided opportunities for the opponent to remove the revived monster by removing the card that summoned it, while Imperial Order was a universal counter to Pot of Greed, Thunderbolt, Harpy's Feather Duster, Cyclone, and all equip magic cards. Imperial Order was seen as a costless version of Magic Jammer because life point costs weren't really costs at all, and were in fact desirable long-term to get to a lower LP than the opponent and activate Megamorph, which yes, people were still running even at 1, and Imperial Order could be turned off effectively whenever you wanted by simply refusing to pay its cost on any given turn. You could deny your opponent access to equip magic and draw for several turns, then when you're ready to go off, refuse to pay for Imperial Order at the start of your next turn and use your magic cards freely. The only reason to use Magic Jammer was because it was a counter trap card, and hence it was faster in terms of spell speed, but the discard cost and situational nature of counter traps at the time made Imperial Order preferable. Both cards could be nullified by Psycho Shocker, so Imperial Order also reinforced that card's dominance in the metagame. While Call of the Living Dead was a more balanced Monster Reborn, it also had a valuable combo with Psycho Shocker. Since Shocker did not nullify any traps until it was already on the field, it was possible to use Call to special summon Shocker from the graveyard, and then have Shocker's effect negate Call's effects, so that Psycho Shocker would not have to leave the field if Call did, functionally turning it into a blank card. This could also be used to negate Call's effect on other monsters summoned by it, so long as the player activated Call before summoning Shocker. And after Shocker blanked out Living Dead's effect, you could also safely bounce it back to hand with Hurricane to set it again and reuse it next turn. Premature Burial was in a similar position to Call, but the condition for destroying the monster it was equipped to was the destruction of Burial itself. Returning it to hand with Hurricane would not trigger that. So, Jinzo power creep aside, this was actually a pretty good, balanced array of new effects, with interesting combos and strategic applications, and of course Konami had to throw in something really dumb. Their really dumb card of this set was Chaos Pod, localized internationally as Morphing Jar No. 2. Chaos Pod's flip effect shuffled both players' monsters into their deck, then revealed cards from the top of their decks until the same number of monsters as they shuffled in were revealed, and then special summoned all of those monsters in face-down defense position while discarding the rest of the revealed cards. Now, if you're an old-school Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG player, you might be wondering why I'd single this card out as especially bad, and the reason is that Japan's version of Chaos Pod was not level restricted. It could special summon anything, not just level 4 or lower monsters. You could bounce a bunch of critters into your deck and get Psycho Shockers out. The version we got was based on a June 2002 errata, and even that has been semi-limited or forbidden for most of the 21st century. However, shuffling in low-level stuff and crapping out high-level cards was just the tip of the iceberg. Because Chaos Pod was a flip effect, it could go off when an opponent's monster attacked it, and while it would still be destroyed if its defense was lower than the attacker's attack, its effect would go off and shuffle all other monsters into the deck. And because they came out in defense mode, the opponent wouldn't be able to continue with their current battle phase, since they'd need to move their monsters into attack mode in a main phase first. So it could almost end their turn, and totally steal the tempo of the game by going off. And because it discarded any cards it didn't summon, it was also a de facto mill card. On top of that, Chaos Pod's special summoning monsters face down synergized with the numerous flip effects used in Mill, recycling already used flips and setting up new ones, and even sending itself into the deck only to bring itself back out. The one caveat to Chaos Pod was that if a player had no monsters to send to their deck, they wouldn't summon any out, and the fewer monsters they had in play, the less likely they were to mill a significant number of cards. The best way for Mill to use it was to create a situation where the Mill player had far fewer monsters than the opponent, causing the opponent to have to reveal a lot of cards and send a lot of them to the graveyard, while the Mill player on average would reveal and discard fewer. Chaos Pod was complemented by the Shallow Grave, a magic card that caused both players to special summon a monster from their graveyards in face-down defense mode. The Shallow Grave could be used to fetch Chaos Pod back after it was destroyed, while forcing the opponent to put another monster down that would make them reveal more cards for Pod later. This was supported by the rules of the time. While in later revisions of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Expert rules you can only activate an effect if it could be fulfilled in its entirety, at the time of Curse of Anubis you could activate the Shallow Grave even if one player didn't have any monsters in their graveyard, and the other player would still be forced to summon one. Having more monsters than the opponent was now a disadvantage in the Age of Chaos Pod mill, and the Shallow Grave was used to make that disadvantage happen. Other decks were not completely hung out to dry. Curse of Anubis also introduced the Apostle of Obliteration, a magic card that destroyed and removed a face-down monster from the game, and if it was an effect monster, removed all copies of it from both players' decks. At the time, there was no way to get monsters removed from the game back, and between Cyberpod, Metamorpot, Needleworm, and Chaos Pod, virtually all monsters used in mill were flip effects. So if you managed to get all three obliterations off, the mill player would have almost nothing left to put on the field. Even losing just one monster was devastating. Metamorpot was best played with as few cards in hand as possible, but if the opponent cast an obliteration before you could get it off, you'd be left with no hand and no field. Apostle of Obliteration wasn't just a hate card for mill either, as in good stuff matchups it was valuable for stopping Critter and Witch of the Black Forest from going off, and these properties would make it a metagame staple for years to come. Another mill hate card was Ceasefire, a trap card that flipped all face-down monsters face-up without activating their effects and burning the opponent 500 points for every effect monster revealed. Against a regular deck this could ruin setup and leave the opponent seriously wounded, but against a mill deck it would leave them with an unusable board state of weak monsters and no options to tribute them to get something stronger out because mill generally didn't run high-level monsters at all. These hate cards made better use of the side deck, but even with them, the balance was still tilted too far in Mill's favor, and as a result, just 1 month after Curse of Anubis' launch, Chaos Pod and Cyberpod were both limited down to 1 per deck as part of the November 2000 restriction list. Even before the ban list though, the beginnings of a challenger to Mill were already emerging. Curse of Anubis introduced one last notable card, Backup Soldier. This was a trap card that could be activated if you had 5 or more monsters in your graveyard, and would add up to 3 normal monsters with 1500 or less attack from your graveyard to your hand. Or in English, it put 3 exodia pieces in your hand. You could fill up the graveyard with the right and left arms and legs using Painful Choice, and then only needed to manually draw or search for Exodia's head, because it's an effect monster so Backup Soldier can't grab it, using Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Critter, and the other usual suspects. This formed what became known as Painful Exodia, as the third deck of the new metagame. By this time, Cannon Burn was rare because of Psycho Shocker shutting it down, and Mahavilo had dropped off in play for similar reasons. The irony of it all was that because the graveyard in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is essentially a second hand, Painful Choice wasn't painful at all, and wasn't even a choice. You got the cards you wanted no matter what the opponent chose. If they went into your hand, you got them. If they went into the grave, you cast Backup Soldier and got them anyway. And also because of Backup Soldier, hand destruction was no longer strong against Exodia, so there were fewer forces reining it in. So between the launch of Curse of Anubis in late September and the next banlist revision on the 1st of November, the metagame came to revolve around a trifecta of Psycho Shocker Good Stuff, Chaos Pod Mill, and Painful Exodia. The November banlist limited the Chaos and Cyber Pods along with Psycho Shocker, Monster Reborn, Killer Snake, Snatch Steal, and Swords of Revealing Light, while Heavy Storm and Imperial Order were semi-limited down to 2. This ban list was primarily targeted at Mill, but also hurt Exodia by hitting Swords of Revealing Light. Good Stuff didn't really care about losing 1 copy of Psycho Shocker because the wisdom of the day was to search it with Witch of the Black Forest. But everybody felt the effects of Killer Snake being put down to 1, as it ruined Painful Choice combos and preemptively hurt Cannon Burn decks before they could even get back on their feet. The decision to hit Monster Reborn and Snatch Steal was a long time coming, but ironically made them more used than before, as players sold off their excess copies, and it became easier for everyone to get their hands on the 1 Monster Reborn or Snatch Steal they needed. The ban list was not the only change to the metagame that November. On the 23rd of the month, Konami launched the first starter deck of Series 2, the EXR Starter Box. It was mostly a reprint of the earlier EX Starter Box, but with 2 important additions: the new magic cards Cross Soul and Hand Obliteration, later localized as Soul Exchange and Card Destruction. Cross Soul allowed you to tribute an opponent's monster instead of your own for a tribute summon, but in exchange stopped you from conducting a battle phase that turn. This made it a combination removal card and means of gaining momentum by both taking a monster off the opponent's board and giving you an advanced monster like Psycho Shocker without the need to waste a turn setting up a tribute. The loss in card advantage for you was the same as if you attributed normally, because you lost a card playing Cross Soul. You could just do it a turn earlier. It was also valuable because it could remove flip effect monsters without risking their effects going off by battling them. Hand obliteration was the main draw of the new product. Both players would discard their hands and draw the same number of cards as they discarded. Similar to the old Wheel of Fortune in Magic the Gathering or the later printed Rockets Admin in Pokemon, this was highly disruptive since it took away whatever combos the opponent was assembling. Unlike those cards, it preserved whatever state of card advantage was already established, since you were both drawing the same number you had discarded. It wasn't something to be used with total reckless abandon, since you didn't want to discard anything you couldn't guarantee you would get back later, but it was a natural tool for the mill deck still recovering from the latest wave of bans. This was a very difficult card for Exodia to deal with, because while it could get back the other pieces using Backup Soldier, if Exodia's head ever hit the graveyard, that was effectively the end of the game. December brought with it the latest Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game, Duel Monsters 4 Battle of Great Duelist. Or rather, it brought with it the latest Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games, because Battle of Great Duelist launched in 3 versions, Yugi, Kaiba, and Jonochi. Konami had observed the success of Pokemon's split versions across 2 generations of games, and like many turn-of-the-millennium game developers, they sought to imitate Pokemon. However, Konami took this a step further than simply having different versions for you to trade between. Like all of their past Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games, Duel Monsters 4 included a number of pack-in promotional cards randomly inserted, but these promos were also version-exclusive and incredibly powerful. Yugi's version included the trap cards Anti-Magic Fragrance and Ring of Destruction. The former was a continuous trap card that forced both players to set their magic cards for a turn before they could activate them, effectively removing the primary advantage of magic cards by making them work like traps. The latter was one of the most broken cards in the game. Before its first errata, Ring of Destruction allowed users to destroy any monster on the field and deal damage equal to its attack power to both players. This made it very easy to remove high-power monsters and burn the opponent all at once. A common use for it at the time was to activate Ring of Destruction during damage calculation. Say your Gemini Elf with Demon's Axe equipped swings for 2900 into the opponent's face. You could then use Ring of Destruction on your own monster to effectively double the damage dealt, up to 5800. As long as you have more life points remaining than the targeted monster has attack and the opponent has less, you win on the spot. It was also used to force draws in tournaments by mutually destroying both players, rather than eating a loss and hurting your own record. As a result of how unbalanced this card was, it would later be limited and eventually forbidden at different times in both the OCG and TCG, and its text was eventually rewritten in 2015 to make it usable only once per turn, only on the opponent's turn, and only targeting monsters they controlled, with attack less than or equal to their life points. Even after the errata, it would continue to be limited until 2018. Kaiba's version included the magic cards Force and the monster Bloodvorce, which was really just a power-crept Gemini Elf, but the important part was that it effectively doubled the number of Gemini Elves you could run in Good Stuff decks, since now you could have up to 6 level 4 monsters with 1900 attack, the highest possible for their level at that time. This was not as fancy as Ring of Destruction, but it was still highly sought after, and a number of players ended up running only one copy because they couldn't afford to buy more copies of the video game or track down singles of Bloodvorce. The Jonochi version got the short end of the stick with generally underwhelming cards. Yugi's version was the most in demand, because of the promos packed in, and Battle of Great Duelist as a whole went on to be the 19th best-selling Game Boy game of all time at 2.5 million copies, in large part because of demand for these promos and for the Egyptian god cards also packed in as a pre-order bonus with each version. These prints of Osiris, Obelisk, and Ra were all illegal. They had no effects except for some text specifying they couldn't be used in a duel, and they were printed with unique card backs, and that caused a great deal of confusion, especially for younger kids that just wanted to play the monsters they were reading about in Shonen Jump magazine. The combination of version splitting and version-specific promos packed in with the games was extremely controversial among Japanese fans. People really hated how greedy Konami was getting, trying to get them all to buy multiple copies of multiple versions of a 4,000 yen video game, actually it was 5,000 after tax, with 3 randomly inserted promo cards out of a pool of 5 each. It was bad for collectors, it was bad for competitive players, and it was bad for kids. And again, 2.5 million copies sold. It was fantastic for Konami. The video game itself was badly received because it played by its own weird rules rather than the real rules of the OCG. Each version was limited to only using 1/3 of the total card pool and couldn't even use the god cards without trading them to another version, and it was transparently part of a seasonal Christmas strategy, so On top of everything else, Konami ruined Christmas that year. As a direct result of Ring of Destruction becoming so metagame defining, Good Stuff's position was strengthened greatly by these new promos, because you could totally shut the ring down just by getting Psycho Shocker into play. Mill and Exodia were still in trouble against Ring of Destruction, because even though they didn't tend to field strong face-up monsters, at the time you could still use Ring to blow up your own monster to go for the kill. Anti-Magic Fragrance became a core piece of a dedicated control deck called Aroma Chain, which combined it with Chain Energy, a card from Magic Ruler that forced players to spend 500 life points to summon or set any monsters from hand. But Aroma Chain was very vulnerable to hand destruction because it depended on a specific card combo to go off, so it didn't see a lot of play. Konami capped off the year with the 4th expansion of Series 2, Thousand Eyes Bible. The previous 3 sets were used to flesh out magic, monsters, and trap cards. Thousand Eyes Bible brought all of that together, with a lot more nuanced and complex card effects to mixed results. First off was Goblin Attack Force, a 4-star monster that broke the established rules of card design by having 2300 attack, but in exchange had 0 defense, and would automatically change to defense mode after attacking and be unable to change its position next turn. While you were almost guaranteed to lose the monster on the turn after you attacked with it, its high attack power and comparatively low downside made it attractive to Good Stuff decks. Probably its most important impact was diminishing the use of wall monsters, as 2000 defense walls were hard to keep around. Then there was the Sorceress Giga Cyber, a level 6 monster with 2200 attack that could special summon itself for free if the opponent had 2 or more monsters than its owner. Giga Cyber was immediately attractive because it could even out the board state and take back the tempo of the game. And while 2200 attack was comparatively low for a monster that would normally require a tribute to summon, the fact that you could special summon it for free meant you could also tribute it for your normal summon of the turn if the need arose. From the traps, the standout cards were Magic Drain and Gravity Bind. Magic Drain worked like a free Magic Jammer, except that the opponent could disable it by discarding a magic card from their hand. If they didn't have one in hand, then it really was just Magic Jammer with no cost. But if they did have one and chose to pay that price, then you could get a lead in card advantage by making them discard. Magic Drain didn't catch on right away, but once Imperial Order went from semi-limited to fully limited the following January, there wasn't much keeping Magic Drain in check, and it started to proliferate into general usage. Gravity Bind, meanwhile, was a continuous trap card that stopped all level 4 or higher monsters from attacking, putting a stop to virtually all of the common attackers of the day. It was an incredibly powerful lockdown card, but it did have one glaring counter, Psycho Shocker. As soon as you summoned him, Gravity Bind would turn off, and because he was searchable through Witch of the Black Forest, it was hard to keep a Gravity Bind lock going. Mill and Exodia both wanted to use Gravity Bind on Good Stuff, but as long as they could get Shocker out, it was an uphill battle. While traps had Magic Drain and Gravity Bind, Magic cards got Cold Wave and Limiter Release. Cold Wave was unique in that it could only be cast during the first main phase of a turn, and stopped both players from playing Magic or Trap cards until its player's next turn. This gave you the freedom to safely set up your board for a turn, and could represent a significant gain in tempo if it blocked the opponent from going after your summoned or set monsters with cards like Disciple of Obliteration. While games were slower at the time, and one turn wasn't as big of a gain as it would be today, as effects became more powerful, players began looking back on Cold Wave more seriously. Limiter Release doubled the power of all face-up machine-type monsters and then destroyed them at the end of the turn. There weren't a ton of uses for this back at launch, because the old machines like Mecha Hunter had been power crept out of the format, while the only new one commonly played was Psycho Shocker, but 4800 attack was nothing to sneeze at. And because Limiter applied to final attack instead of base attack, it would also double any other bonuses on Shocker like Demon's Axe or Megamorph. There was obviously a lot of potential in Limiter Release, it just wasn't fully realized. Finally, there was the cover card. The monster that served as the face of Thousand Eyes Bible was also the final boss of the Duelist Kingdom arc, Thousand Eyes Sacrifice. This was a fusion monster that had a ritual monster as part of its required materials, which made it essentially impossible to use in regular play, because you would have to first draw and then play the required ritual magic card, offer 2 monsters as tribute to summon Sacrifice, then summon Thousand Eyes Idol, and play the fusion magic card to combine the idol with Sacrifice to make Thousand Eyes Sacrifice. That was way too many steps to ever be practical, so players needed loopholes to actually get Thousand onto the board. There were a couple approaches to this, but the only practical one was using our old pal Devil Franken to pay 5000 LP and just dump Thousand Eyes right onto the field. Summoning it like this was costly, and came with the caveat that if it was destroyed by a card effect, it would go back to the fusion deck instead of the graveyard, because it wasn't properly fusion summoned, so you couldn't revive it with something like Call of the Living Dead or Monster Reborn. But since Devil Franken could be inserted standalone into anything, it wasn't like your whole strategy revolved around it. Using sacrifice like this was desirable because you didn't have to commit to anything to do it. And why would you want to go through all of that trouble? Well, because if you break out a magnifying glass to actually read its effect, Thousand Eyes Sacrifice was inarguably the strongest effect monster in the game. It stopped all other monsters from changing their battle positions or declaring attacks, and once per turn could equip an opponent's monster to it to copy its attack and defense, a nearly perfect recreation of how it worked in the manga. The only thing it was missing was that originally, if Thousand Eyes would be destroyed, then its equipped monster was destroyed instead, which was later added in through an errata after the effect box was expanded for Series 3. It was a natural partner for Devil Franken, since its attack-stopping ability neutralized the major weakness of having an attack mode Franken out and vulnerable. This is basically the legacy of Thousand Eyes Bible. It was a set with a lot of potential, and most of it took years to actually be realized. There were a lot of potentially powerful effects in the set, like 4-starred Ladybug of Doom, Bubonic Vermin, and Meteor Strike, but none of them were widely played at launch, and even the best cards of the set needed time before they would come into their own. The result was that the metagame didn't actually change much after the set dropped. It was still good stuff Mill and Exodia, running mostly the same lists, but with some Magic Drain and Goblin Attack Force thrown in. As part of Konami's marketing push for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Brand, the anime was featured at the Jump Festa 2000 convention on December 16th and 17th. This was where Premium Pack 4 was initially sold, as part of a special pre-sale before it went out to stores in January. This premium pack was themed around Yugi's magician cards from the Battle City arc, including the mascot character Black Magician Girl, but its most important contribution to the metagame was the card Magic Cylinder. This trap card negated one attack and damaged the opponent equal to the attacker's attack, and in combination with Ring of Destruction it could punish a reckless opponent by blowing through all of their life points on the spot. However, its time in the spotlight didn't last long, because Magic Cylinder was restricted before the premium pack even went out to stores. The January 2001 ban list limited it to 1 per deck, making it hard to pull off and forcing players to be very careful about when they timed their cylinders. With this kind of punishing burn in the format, players began to be more careful about how they rationed their life points, especially with dropping below the 4,000 range. Magic Cylinder was not the only card to get hit. Limiter Removal, Painful Choice, Backup Soldier, Call of the Haunted, Ceasefire, and Imperial Order were all put down to 1. Critter, Witch of the Black Forest, Apostle of Obliteration, Force, and Ring of Destruction were all semi-limited to 2, and Last Will and Swords of Revealing Light both went from limited to semi-limited, while Gravekeeper's Servant was freed from the ban list entirely. Hitting Painful Choice and Backup Soldier was a pretty transparent shot at Exodia, and going after Critter, Witch, and Living Dead also hurt that deck in addition to a bunch of others by limiting search and revival options. Hitting Apostle of Obliteration strengthened Mill, while limiting Imperial Order resulted in other traps getting stronger, particularly Magic Drain. And the hits to Magic Cylinder and Ring of Destruction were important because they reduced the value of 2 hard-to-get cards while weakening burn decks as a whole. In Japan, it's generally thought that Ceasefire was limited for the same reason, to prevent burn from becoming too dominant. What was not understandable was going after Force and Limiter Removal. While neither card was considered bad at the time, they also weren't being played. They would remain on the list until April 2003, and Limiter Removal would eventually go back in for entirely understandable reasons from 2005 to 2019. Last Will coming off the list made people nervous even after it was errated to only be once per turn, and the card would ultimately go back in 4 years later, eventually being forbidden entirely. And finally, nobody knows why Gravekeeper's Servant was put on the list in the first place, and nobody knows why it came off either. The end, no moral. With Exodia kicked down into low-tier hell alongside Reanimate and Aroma Chain, Good Stuff and Mill were left to slug it out as the top decks of the 2001 format. But they wouldn't be there for long, because with the OCG now entering its 3rd year, the game plan for Yu-Gi-Oh! Was all about solidifying the brand as something more than a manga. Week by week, the Battle City tournament finals were wrapping up in Shonen Jump, and would play out over the next 2 years, while the anime was closing out the Duelist Kingdom arc, and would be starting on Battle City in April. Konami had one of the most popular properties in Japan, but their demographic appeal was much narrower than Pokemon. And Takahashi wouldn't be making the manga forever. If the game was to keep printing its blood money, they would need to establish a brand that stood independent of its source material. So for 2001, Konami diversified, with its first expert rule video games, adaptations of the Dungeon Dice Monsters figure game as a fallback, and the first localized releases of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime and product lines overseas.